Josh, you're up again.
All right, let's shift production to Stone Temple Pilots, or STP for short, with Purple. And in the opening montage, you heard Interstate Love Song, and now you're going to... What are the stats on this album?
Yeah, so Purple by Stone Temple Pilots comes in at number 106 in the 1990s on Best Ever Albums, number 20 in 1994, number 622 of all time. It's Stone Temple Pilots' highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. It did not make Rolling Stone's list, and Stone Temple Pilots ranked number 319 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
Okay, this album came out June 7th, 1994. They formed in San Diego in 1989 and later moved to LA. Matt and John covered them previously on bonus 4 of the season with their first album, Core. This is their second album. The band consists of Scott Weiland, who I should say died in 2015 of an accidental drug overdose. He had a long history with drug abuse issues. He's on vocals. Brothers Dean and Robert DeLeo are on guitar and bass / backing vocals, and Eric Kretz is on drums. They have 8 studio albums. They are still an active band, albeit with a different lead singer, and genres are alt rock, grunge, hard rock, and if you're feeling nasty, post grunge as well. The influences are Led Zeppelin, Cheap Trick, and T-Rex. Those are the original bands that the guys listened to or were into when they got together. Also, Soundgarden and Jane's Addiction are big influences. Similar artists, there's a million of this era: Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Everclear, Soul Asylum, Foo Fighters, Space Hog. The list goes on and on. Bush, probably even. Sour Girl reached number 78 on the Hot 100. That's from a later album. Plush, Interstate Love Song, and Vaseline were all number 1 on the mainstream rock airplay chart, and Purple was number 1 for 3 weeks on the Billboard 200 when it debuted. Some fun facts. Some of the members first started out in a band called Swing before they changed their name to Mighty Joe Young, and then they settled on Stone Temple Pilots after being inspired by the STP motor oil stickers that exist out there in the blue, red, and white logo. Their first show was opening for Henry Rollins, and after Core came out, they were opening for bands such as Rage Against the Machine and Megadeth. This is a band that got negative press from the critics, but were popular with the public. January 1994 Rolling Stone poll, the band was simultaneously voted Best New Band by Rolling Stone's readers and Worst New Band by the magazine's music critics. So I feel like that was kind of the narrative that I remember as well, that fans liked them and they were not critically appreciated. The cover art is a child riding a qilin, which is a hoofed chimera creature from Chinese mythology. It's like a dragon mixed with some other animals, accompanied by 5 fairies, and the album title is written as a Chinese character, which you see in the corner there. Purple ended up selling over 6 million copies. I think it said it sold like 3 million within like the first year or something crazy like that. And they completed making the album in less than a month when they went into the studio. So that's pretty impressive as well. Their first single, The Big Empty, appeared on MTV Unplugged in 93 and would later appear on the Crow soundtrack in 94. That's a big soundtrack album. And that's all I have for this. So I think we're all familiar with Stone Temple Pilots. I did not go back and listen to your guys' review of Core, so I'm interested to hear. And let's start with John this time. What do you think of this album?
Well, it's interesting. We've done Audiker and we've done Guided by Voices, two groups that I didn't have much of a relationship with, and I was doing the reaction, but also building my knowledge of the sounds on each of them, right? Like lo-fi and electronic ambient in general. This album I owned and listened to a jillion times between 1994 and 1997. Although I don't think I've listened to this album in entirety in like 20 years, even though there was a long period of time, because it's not a very long album, that I listened to this album quite a bit. I owned it on cassette tape. It was one of the last cassette tapes I remember owning before I went full-on CD along the way. So when I was listening to this album, I still can remember where I'd flip the cassette when I was listening to it, because that was how I listened to this album most of the time, because there was no streaming and I didn't have it on CD and I was consuming it that way. It's so interesting having done Core and now Purple, because Core It's funny that the STP got savaged by the critics because they're a very good band. And I think it was just unfortunate that they were the first post-grunge band, but they were a very good band. But because they weren't what was familiar and stuff, they kind of got shit on and stuff. But knowing what came later, it's almost kind of comical to listen to people say, oh, STP, they're a little bit more phony. And so I'm like, not at all, really. I think also while Core got knocked for being grunge, like there isn't much grunge on this album at all. This is much more inspired by certainly Led Zeppelin, right? And like 70s Aerosmith and the Stones and Kiss. I mean, there's big ass guitar riffs all over this. It's a very like sexy, like pick you up at the bar or the club type album. You know what I mean? It's like Scott Weiland kind of like always dripped sex a little bit, and the riffs are sleazy, so it's got a little Iggy Pop feel to it as well, like in terms of the general vibe of the video. But yeah, big guitar riffs on this, Zeppelin inspired for sure, but it almost feels like a classic rock album thrown into 1994. And that's how I used to feel about this album when it first came out. And that's why I really don't process Stone Temple Pilots as either grunge or even like 90s alt sometimes. They almost seem like a tribute act to like 70s rock and roll in some ways. They have a very like LA vibe to them too, which I think that's where they're from, right? LA, and they sound like LA, you know, in the same way that like Guns N' Roses sounded like LA. There's just like an attitude that goes along with it. But from the very beginning, the singles are some of the better songs of the 90s. Like Interstate Love Song is nearly a perfect 3.5 minute alternative rock song, I'd say. Big Empty was in The Crow, right? And there's different versions of it, all of which were popular and I can remember hearing. They're a very good slow tempo band as well. STP, that's something that not a lot of bands can do, slow it down and have just as good of songs, and there's multiple good ones on this. And there's even Vaseline was a big hit stuff, but there's also like deeper cuts on this album that are very good as well. I like how it starts off with just that big ass guitar on Meat Plow. It catches your attention right away. And one thing that I like about the Stone Temple Pilots is I like the way all of the pieces come together in the Stone Temple Pilots. They're just the DeLeo brothers and Scott Weiland, the drums, and I apologize, I'm blanking on the drummer's name right now.
Eric Kretz.
Eric Kretz, there you go. I just think they almost were like born to be in a band together because the riffs, the drumming, and the vocal work are so perfectly suited. And you just forget sometimes how many good songs Stone Temple Pilots have. You also forget how big this album was, because it was a gigantic freaking album at the time, and almost everybody I knew, regardless of the genre of music they listened to, owned this album. So when you said 3 million in the first year, it's like, yeah, that tracks, because a lot of different people I knew owned this album. And I always did find it interesting just how much the critics hated this band and just how much everybody I knew liked this band, regardless of only the scensterest of scenesters, right? Like, didn't like this band.
Yeah.
And the other thing I remember about it was people I knew who were older really liked this band, and it makes sense because these are riffs that they immediately, if you're somebody who listens to 70s rock or even late 60s or 80s rock, right? Like, there's riffs that are familiar here. And the Scott Weiland type of lead singer, like the sex just dripping out of, the sound. So in that sense, it makes sense why they were always probably the most well-regarded alt-rock band to me of people I knew who at the time were in their 40s and 50s. So yeah, strong thumbs up for me on this one. Really don't get the credit they deserve. Scott Weiland also doesn't get the credit as a lead singer he deserves. Mm-hmm. He's got like just the it that you either have or you don't have. Visually, sonically, he's got a very distinctive voice. He's got just enough yarl and just enough raspiness and just enough prettiness in his voice that it comes together that it just screams like lead singer in a way that very few people do. And Yeah, so I don't necessarily, I'm not doing as good a job in terms of going into the nuts and bolts of it, and I'll probably jump in on each of your reactions to add stuff about specific songs, but I'm certain that Matt has a relationship with this album too, and so I'll punt over to him.
Yeah, I definitely do. I have it with all three of their first three albums. I own all of those. And I did look a little bit into the reviews that I saw, especially at the time. And not only are they negative, but it's very much kind of beating the same drum. A lot of the criticism is that they're just derivative. They're a poor man's insert whatever other poor man's Nirvana, poor man's Soundgarden, poor man's Alice in Chains. And I think I also listened to the review that John and I did with Core, and I said on that review that like I remember growing up, like, kind of thinking myself, like, they seem to be at a lower tier than the four major grunge bands of the time. But I still liked them quite a bit. I just remember them like, and that was probably a lot of the critics that, that I came across, because I knew that they didn't get great reviews at the time. And it's also because like those other bands were more established, and then they came on, and like I said in that review of Core, I'm like, the first time I saw them do Plush, I'm like, I was confused for like a couple minutes, thinking, why did Eddie Vedder dye his hair red? Right? I legit thought it was Pearl Jam, like many other people did. So yeah, they just get this knock for they're so derivative, right? And we've talked about that before with like John, you brought up with Oasis. They're just very derivative, right? And that term is used a lot of times in a very negative way. And it's like I don't know.
But do these guys feel as derivative to you as Oasis does? Because they don't.
I mean, look at all the bands that you cited that they sounded like, that they were from the '70s, all the Aerosmith and the Led Zeppelin and all of these things. I mean, that's derivative of that music, right? And so, I'm not saying
fair.
What I'm arguing is I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because you can be derivative. You can kind of steal elements from bands that came before you, and let's face it, most bands do. Who's coming out with something
every band at this
totally new? It's so rare to have somebody do something totally new. You're going to be derivative of something. Yeah. But just because you're doing that doesn't mean you can write a good song, right? Doesn't mean you can write a good guitar riff or good lyrics or something that's not generic, right? And so but when I hear a band like Oasis or like Stone Temple Pilots...
Can I give you a counterpoint to that a little bit, though, Matt, real quick? I think, for example, I'll just use the Oasis example because that's what you're using, but I don't mean to pick on that. But like everything on Oasis sounded like exact songs that I could tie it to. Whereas like something like Interstate Love Song on this has bits and pieces of stuff, but it's very much its own thing. And I'm not like, oh, that's Stone Temple Pilots doing this. It's the Stone Temple Pilots with elements of the guitar sound and stuff. Whereas nothing on Oasis, I wasn't like, oh, that's them doing this song. Does that make sense? So to me, it's a thinner sketch versus a wider sketch versus a more specific sketch.
Okay, and I guess maybe where I'm coming from is that Interstate Love Song is a great song, and Live Forever is a great song, right? And I enjoy listening to them equally, okay? And so like if people want to get down and nitpick like certain things, like this is a little bit more derivative, there's less new things happening here, fine. But from my perspective, it's like, okay, but if you do that really well, then who cares, right? Like, why? Stone Temple Pilots puts out this album, and my argument for this album, much better than Core. Now, I liked Core quite a bit.
I agree.
This album, now they're branching out more, right? Now they're throwing, there's more psychedelia in here. Yep. There's more interesting things happening. A song like Loungefly, that's a really cool song with a great chorus. That's just that song stood out to me this week coming around, as did Still Remains. That was another song that I was like, geez, I don't remember giving this song as much credit as I think it probably deserved. But Army Ants, Unglued, Kitchenware and Candy Bars, like all these songs that weren't singles. Meat Plow, you're absolutely right, John. That is a great opening track. That guitar riff, like, okay, we're in, like we're getting right into it. It's got great singles, but this has great deep cuts as well. And I think that they're really expanding their sound and becoming more of their own. This is certainly, if we're going back to Oasis, there's certainly more branching out from Core. They're certainly probably doing more things than Oasis maybe ever did, because Oasis kind of stayed in that lane.
That's kind of what I was going to say. Like Oasis, like to me, you're not as much a copy if you're syncretic of like 4 or 5 different things. Like To me, that's
Right.
a harder ask. And I'm kind of with you, Matt. It's like, I don't feel the need to be cool kid. Like, oh, I know that this sounds like this, so fuck everything that sounds like it after. That's a stupid way to do music. But I do think this picks and pulls and the degree of difficulty, right?
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
you're bringing in, like you said, psychedelic and classic rock and ballads and stuff. I just think, to me, it's less derivative because you're not derivative of one thing.
Right.
You're pulling different stuff and bringing it. Whereas
That's
like
fair.
Oasis is always going to make British,
Yeah.
inspired pop rock.
They're
That's
also
true.
not like just straight up like copying those other more popular or most popular bands at
Especially
the
here,
time.
especially in this record. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe you could make the case with Core because that was more straight ahead, like grunge blues rock kind of stuff. But this
Yeah.
is they're clearly. That's why the sophomore album, like I always said, this was a good quote. Like it, and I forget who I heard it from, but like, oh, it was from a TV show, like a TV show where the rock critic is like, a band spends their entire lives writing their first album. They spend like 6 months or a year writing their second
Right.
one. You know what I mean? So like that second album really kind of separates, if you really got something versus something that was kind of just like just lightning in a bottle, perhaps. But you're right. And this album got the little bit on, what is it, Big Empty? You got a little bit of a country feel with the slide guitar, right? So yes, Johnny, you're right. The degree of difficulty, that's another good way of putting it. They are putting themselves out there more. They're trying new things, and we should probably credit that as being more impressive than if you stick to your guns. I also would still argue at the same time, like, yeah, but if you keep writing greats, like with Oasis' second album, they did freaking, Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in Anger and some of these other, Cast No Shadow and just these Champagne Supernova, right? They still wrote great songs. So I just was like rolling my eyes reading these reviews, going like, who gives a shit if they sound a little bit like Soundgarden on,
Well, we have the
Unglued or whatever.
We have the benefit of knowing how the rest of the '90s go. So
Yeah, exactly. Just strap in because, and I also take issue, like if anybody categorizes this band as post grunge, because we covered that already with like Bush and Live. I'm like, no. This is not the same thing. Yes, I could say Bush, and I like elements of Bush and Live plenty, right? But this is still honing in on that lane of like with these other, the '90s alt rock bands, and even though they're kind of more, maybe as John's saying, they're a little bit more in
This is much better. Like,
yes,
let's
exactly.
be honest. This is much better.
Oh, yes,
this is a better band.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, also, like, let's also remember the critics famously hated Led Zeppelin.
Yes.
Hated '70s Aerosmith, and I know Matt likes to, and he hates later Aerosmith, and I get it. But '70s Aerosmith is its own thing. That's blues rock, and
Right.
they hated, the big monster riffs of Kiss. They hated all those bands, right? So it makes sense that like the critics that come in the '90s who are inspired by that, it's like, oh, big guitar hooks that everybody likes. Well, fuck that. I can't like that. You know what I mean? And it's like it's just a continuation of a theme that was there. So I just want to point that out.
This is of the three albums that I know really well. The core of this one and Tiny Music. This is definitely my favorite. It's certainly a couple of steps beyond what they did in Core, and I don't think there's a bad song on here. And I really, especially those songs, I think Loungefly and Still Remains in particular, but also Silver Gun, Superman, Unglued, Army Ants. They were all
songs.
but that's the thing. Like,
the average track score is extremely high on this
the
album.
score is really high on this album.
So I'm big thumbs up on this, and I guess I'll pass it over to Josh. But before you talk about this, Josh, you didn't listen to our episode? Did you listen to Core though? Are you familiar with that at all, or is this your first foray into STP?
No, I knew Core. I'd listened to it at some point along the way, and I'd heard this album before, but it's been a really long time, I think. And I agree with you. This is a great album. I don't understand, or I mean, I don't agree with the critic sentiment at the time. I feel like this album holds up really well, with the hard guitar, the great riffs. I gotta emphasize how great Scott Weiland's voice is. It's such like a confident, like strong voice. I watched the Headbangers Ball acoustic performance of Plush that got them some notoriety. I watched that on YouTube, and it's just him and with the other guy on acoustic and sing, and that was great, and that kind of like emphasized his voice to me as well. But yeah, there's no like bad songs on this album, and I agree with you guys both how I can tell that they are trying, dabbling in different genres or adding elements of other genres in, with either it being the country or like some more like blues inflected stuff. I got like a Chili Peppers vibe on Lounge Fly, which has like really big drums too. I feel like they bring the drums to the front on that song in an interesting way. I got a Jane's Addiction kind of vibe with Army Ants, which I also liked. And even Kitchenware and Candy Bars is a pretty good finisher, but I think Meat Plow really kind of like sets the tone and grabs you with that hard like guitar riff at the beginning, and just got me like amped for this album. And then hearing the singles that I had heard a million times, they weren't old. I still really liked all of them, and I don't know, it just made me appreciate this album and this band a lot listening to them this week. There's no negative things. If you like all those bands, if you like Kiss, if you like just like great like kind of blues underpin foundational guitar rock with like hard elements, elements of Soundgarden sprinkled somewhere, you're gonna like this album. So and this like fits right into the lane of or the Venn diagram of things I like too. So no complaints from me. This is a thumbs up.
Yeah, we haven't even mentioned Unglued, by the way, which is a fucking fantastic song and like a great karaoke song as well, that I think is probably the best use of Scott Weiland's voice on the entire album as well. So I do want to shout that. I feel like we've talked about every other song, and I'm like, it's funny because I picked Unglued as one of the 2 songs for the playlist. So I'm like, well, I should throw that in there. So
yeah.
So consider us all.
We do cover Tiny Music too, so we'll hit that. We'll hit that up again. So,
and throw me also in the thing that sometimes bands pick names that hurt them, and I think Stone Temple Pilots is one of those band names that probably hurts them a little bit as a band name. Is my take.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I
don't think it's a great name either.
Yeah.
I never had an issue with it, and when it's short in STP, it's like works even.
When it shortens to STP, it works, which is, I think, why everybody did it. But, like, it's kind of one of those things, because they've been around for so long, you might not think of it. But, like, if you're just hearing about it or becoming aware of them, I don't necessarily... It feels forced, right? STP sticker, Stone Temple Pilots. What does that really mean? So,
Yeah.